Hello and welcome again to yet another episode of This Week in Christian History. And we are always excited to learn new things about different people or different events or things that have shaped the greater, bigger part of events within Christian history. And today is yet another great example. And we're going to learn more about Anthony Benezet, who was a eventual Quaker, started out as a Huguenot who put a lot of energy and effort into free education and schools for African American children in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And one of the people we are pleased and proud to have as our guest today is Professor Brycchan Carey, who is a professor of many parts of humanities and others at Northumbria University in the northern part of England and the UK. So, Professor, thank you so much for taking time with us today.
Well, thank you for asking me.
Absolutely. Well, tell us a little bit. We're using the date of one of his publications, which I think was I don't remember the exact title, but it's around reflections on things that happened in Guinea, maybe, or New Guinea or something, which was June 28, 1770 is what we have down. So that's why we're using that as our date to be able to talk about him. But give us some background on who Anthony was and why you think we would be talking about him on a podcast.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Well, first of all, just start with the name,
Sure.
Anthony Benezet, because he's often mispronounced, and he was actually in his later life he would have said his name very differently to the name he was born with. He was born in northern France, in a place called Saint-Quentin in northern France, and he was born as Antoine Benezet.
Hmm.
And his family were Huguenot, that is to say, they were French Protestants. And the family fled quite early in at that point Antoine's life. They fled across the border into the Netherlands. They settled in Rotterdam
Hmm.
for a little while, and then they moved to London. And they joined what was quite a large community of Huguenots in London in the early 18th century, sort of French Protestant refugees. And while they were there, the Benezet family first of all, they converted to Quakerism. They also
Hmm.
started pronouncing their names in a more English fashion. So Benezet became Benezet. And we know that he pronounced the T at the end of his name in later life because sometimes he spells his name with two T's, a very emphatic two T's to show us that we have to pronounce the T. Um, and we think he was probably Anthony. He was born Antoine, so the hard T is in there. So he was probably Anthony rather than Anthony. Antoine Benezet, born in France, became Anthony Benezet in London. And they, as I said, they converted to Quakerism and moved to the Quaker colony of Pennsylvania in around 1730.
Okay.
So this was at a point when Pennsylvania was becoming more established, and when its principal city, which had only a couple of decades before been little more than a village, really, but by this time was
Hmm.
turning into what we would now think of today as quite a substantial town, even a small city. So they were moving into, in fact, it became the biggest city in the British American colonies at that time, so he moves to this Quaker colony with his parents at the age of 18. And you can just
Okay.
imagine what it must have been like for a sort of a child who'd started in France, spent time in the Netherlands, grown up probably mostly in London, to be translated again or transported again across the Atlantic this time, a voyage which would have taken several months to the city of Philadelphia, where they found themselves surrounded by people of their faith, their newly adopted faith of Quakerism. And that's where Benezet would remain for the rest of his life.
Well, what was his father's profession? Did they have particular that they were just trying to there for religious freedom? I mean, Quakers being persecuted in England at the time would have been a pretty hefty thing, right? And so getting out of there, number one, was probably a motivation. But did he also have a particular vocation, profession, or something that his father or his family did? turn of living?
Yeah, you're putting me on the spot a little here, but
Oh,
his
I'm
father was
sorry.
in
Okay.
trade. He was a tradesman, and
Okay.
they were from a kind of what we would today call a middle class family, a sort of
Okay.
middling sort of traders, and so on. He had a business, and we know that they sort of involved in various forms of trade. For example, we do know that his father, that's Jean-Étienne de Benezet, represented the great French polymath writer Voltaire
Oh,
represented
really?
his interests in London. So he was
Huh.
involved in that sort of business, sort of dealings between the French and the English in London at that point. And when they moved to Philadelphia, they carried on in business. And Anthony initially set up in business himself, but it turned out
Huh.
he wasn't very good at it. He wasn't a natural businessman. He was not very good at the wheeling and dealing and so on. And so instead, he gravitated more towards education, and
Mhm.
his career for at the time people would have thought of him as a school teacher primarily.
How about that? And so, how then does he kind of transform, if you will, or move into the thought processes of abolitionism and really this idea that, as I understand it, and which is kind of a Quaker equalitarian idea as well. Hey, everybody, women, people who, no matter what your skin tone is or where you come from, you should be able to have the opportunity for an education. I mean, that's somewhere. Did he have any kind of like an epiphany moment that this just kind of came to him, or did this happen over time that he really wanted to put his energy and effort into that?
It's an interesting question. If he did have a moment of epiphany, I don't know what it was,
Okay.
and it's not recorded. It does more look like a gradual process, actually.
Mm,
I think also we should just say that the Quakers, um, the way that you characterize them as sort of looking for the equality of all people, uh, isn't necessarily something they set out with. This was a
mm,
developing conversation amongst Quakers,
okay.
and it took Quakers a very long time to, for example, come from the sort of first stirrings of anti-slavery to what we would now think of as abolitionism,
Ah,
because abolitionism is really a kind of active stance against slavery, against the slave trade, where you're actually saying, let's get rid of it, let's abolish this. Anti-slavery is a bit more diffuse. It's lots of people can be against slavery or against
right.
the enslaving other people without necessarily taking an active stance about it. But when Benezet got to Philadelphia in the 1730s, there had actually been a conversation going on amongst Quakers, perhaps not other people, but Quakers certainly, about whether it was right or wrong to make slaves of others. In fact, there'd been some conversation about this amongst Quakers in Barbados as
Hmm.
long back as the sort of 1670s, 1680s. That conversation had been picked up in Philadelphia right at the end of the 17th and at the beginning of the 18th century, and it kind of came and went and so on. When Benezet arrived in Philadelphia, there were a couple of Quakers, Ralph or Rafe Sanderford. I'm not sure whether it's Ralph or Rafe, but Sanderford and Benjamin Lay, who are now quite well known, but they were probably a little bit marginal at the time. But they were making a kind of very um, a visible anti-slavery protest. Benjamin Lay, for example, he's quite well known in Philadelphia and in anti-slavery circles for his kind of anti-slavery stunts. Quite famously, he once sort of hollowed out a Bible, filled it with pokeberry juice, which looks a bit like blood, and he took his sword and he thrust it through this Bible, splattering the Quaker meeting with what they thought for a moment was blood, just to say that, he was saying, but by enslaving others, you are
Uh,
murdering the word of God, was his view. Now,
wow.
these didn't necessarily change people's minds in Quaker communities in the 1730s, but they did mean that people were talking about slavery in a way that others in other communities across the English speaking world weren't so much. And so for this young man, who's just arrived from London. He's
Hmm.
in Philadelphia for the first time. He's exposed to new ideas. It must have been something that he became aware of and was inspired by, or at least that piqued his interest. So what we find is that for the next sort of 2 or 3 decades, he's becoming more and more well, he's mostly an educationalist, but he's more and more interested in the situation of enslaved people in Philadelphia. So he's teaching in the English school in Philadelphia, and it's by the 1750s. So we're now talking 20 years. He's now since he arrived. He's now in his late 30s, maybe early
Hmm.
40s. He starts opening up the school, or at least opening up opportunities for learning to people of color, to enslaved people in Philadelphia at that time. And this is a kind of a quite a revolutionary thing here. You know, he's what he's trying to do is extend opportunity as far as is possible in a slave owning society. He's trying
Hmm.
to extend opportunities for learning to everybody, whether free or enslaved, whether white or black. And I think that process of opening up education is also a process in which he becomes to more and more deeply feel, as he would call it, the iniquity of slavery, a phrase that he uses. And so I think, to get back to a question about epiphany, I don't know that there was any epiphany moment, but we can see in his career as an educationalist this kind of growing desire to, first of all, to help enslaved people, and then to free them.
How about that? Hey, we're enjoying our conversation that we're having here with Professor Carey, and we're talking about Anthony Benezet and his work in education. Um, so, a couple of pieces. When you say he was an educationalist, put that in context for people who might try to think of about free public schools that you would go to today, or what, it was nothing like that. Were these private tutors? Were there kind of a mix of in between? You had to pay the guy to be able to teach. I mean, here is, what did that kind of look like during that time period?
Yeah, there wasn't state provided education at that time in the way that there is now. Um, it is, I think, fair to say Quakers were quite keen on education, generally speaking,
Hmm.
particularly, Quakers educating other Quakers and so on. So they were quite well known as people who generally received good educations, at least within the school system. The Quaker universities is something that happens a little bit later. The but yeah, the important point here is that education for boys was considerably more advanced than it was for girls, but he was
Hmm.
very interested in educating girls as well as boys. And there was almost no provision for educating people of color, and particularly not for enslaved people of color. So that was a real breakthrough that he did there. And he did so, I think, on a sort of charitable basis to start with. And using the language of the time, what he called the Negro School was, first of all, as I understand it, it was sort of held in rooms all over the town, and it
Mm.
wasn't until the way he could sort of beg or borrow access to spaces to hold those classes. And they were
Okay.
evening classes; they were held, on his own time. And It wasn't until a little bit later that became kind of more formalized into an actual school, as we would think of it, as a sort of school building. But I think it's at this time as well why he's teaching, and he's extending his teaching across the whole kind of community in Philadelphia, that he's also becoming more engaged with the movement within Quakerism to I'm going to use the word outlaw very carefully, because Quakers only have jurisdiction really over their own community, over people
Hmm.
within the Society of
Right.
Friends. But he gets more and more involved in the movement to prevent fellow Quakers, other friends, from being involved in slave trading, or the owning enslaved people.
Mm. And so, I mean, does he, is it the kind of thing where he has to kind of bring people along as well to understand the value to do this? Did he get pushback from that, from the community from within the Friends, or did he get pushback probably even more outside of the society that would have been people who would not have been a part of that? I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
what was that like for him?
Well, I think if we go into the 1750s, it was a period of considerable sort of change and some sort of turmoil for Quakers in Pennsylvania. Not just because of the slavery question, but also because this is the time of the 7 Years' War, as we would call it on this side of the Atlantic, the French and
Hmm.
Indian Wars. It's often referred to in North America. But there's this kind of period of war, which because Quakers have the peace testimony, they're
Hmm.
pacifists. They were called upon to participate in the defense of the colony of Pennsylvania, which they didn't want to do. So there was a big conflict here between the Quaker desire to be involved in the government of Pennsylvania and their unwillingness to be involved in the conflict to come to its defense, which led to some Quakers, well, first of all, some, and over the following decade, most Quakers walking out of government processes. So it was a time of kind of political turmoil for Quakers
Hmm.
in the 1750s. But there was also a time in which this debate about enslavement was being reopened, and it was being reopened by a number of people, but primarily the name that many people will know is John Woolman. John Woolman is a very famous Quaker of this period, and he writes a book which is directed towards other Pennsylvanian Quakers, explaining why he thinks that enslavement is wrong, why slave trading and slave ownership are wrong, and that seems to have persuaded the sort of main meeting. Quakers have got a hierarchical thing. They have sort of local, regional, and national meetings, and then there's in London there's the main sort of top of the hierarchy.
Right.
But the Philadelphia yearly meeting starts considering this question. Again, they had done on and off for many decades, in fact, but they reopened the question. And a couple of years after Woolman's book comes out, the Quaker Yearly Meeting asks for a text to be drawn up clarifying their position. Now, we're not
Huh.
exactly sure who wrote every word of that because not only were Woolman and Benezet involved, but there was a rather large subcommittee of the yearly meeting who went through and
Okay.
edited it through and through. So it's really a composite text. But we do know that Benezet was one of the most kind of important people in in formulating what I suppose, we would call Quaker policy in
Mm.
Pennsylvania about enslavement. And this is a book called An Epistle of Caution and Advice Concerning the Buying and Keeping of Slaves. And you can tell by the title that it's not exactly kind of laying down the law. Caution and advice isn't
Ah,
really what we might think of as kind of a
right.
strong set of
Kind of
regulations,
easing
but
into it.
nevertheless, it does change the sort of way that the Quakers in Pennsylvania are thinking about enslavement.
But that is in kind of the hierarchical way as you referred to of the way that and again I'm not a Quaker church polity expert by any stretch, but that was something that they did within that community of friends that were there. There could have been another community in New York or in New Jersey or in wherever else they would have been operating that said, this is kind of the way we think about it over here. It doesn't mean that those things, that documents like that weren't swapped back and forth and didn't get kind of moved up through the hierarchy for later. But this was just at least starting in their community in Philadelphia. This is kind of what we believe, or some advice and some ideas about start kind of thinking about this instead of saying this has gone from a question to a statement. But instead of just saying, "Hear ye, therefore now we have passed this edict, and this is what's right and wrong, and we all need to start following and getting in line." That was not their way to do it. They thought maybe it was a much better way, maybe to
Well,
ease into it.
yes,
That's a lot. I
yes and
know. I'm
no.
sorry about.
Well, so the Quakers write to each other. They're great letter writers. One of the reasons why historians love studying Quakers in this period is because they write to each other constantly. So we've got lots and lots of evidence of
Oh,
what they're
great.
saying to each other. And the what we might think of as the sort of Quaker headquarters in London, the London Yearly Meeting, sends annual letters out to all of the other yearly meetings. So they would send a letter to the New England Yearly Meeting, the
Mm.
Philadelphia Yearly Meeting, the Virginia Yearly Meeting, and so on, and others around. And so it was kind of important that when one Quaker community, in this case, um, Philadelphia, had reached a decision about what they wanted to do, that they would then kind of want that to be communicated to all the other Quaker communities. So, first of all, what happens is after a period of some debate, in 1758, the Quakers in Philadelphia come to a much firmer position. It takes them a while because
Mm.
they've never done this before. They're working step by step, and they must have thought each year, well, we've sorted that out, but then that raised a new issue, and so. But by 1758, the Philadelphia Quakers had pretty much determined that if you were part of the yearly meeting there and you kept slaves, then it would be they would send somebody to you to talk you out of it at the very least, and that
Ah,
um, you might be debarred from attending meetings for business or being able to apply for poor relief if you fell into hard times or so on. They would never turn people away from meetings for worship, but they would perhaps say you're in disunion, as they would put it. You can't be
mhm.
part of some of the other Quaker networks, and that happens by 1758 in Philadelphia. And then we've got this kind of record where we have a number of Philadelphia Quakers traveling to London and talking to the London meeting. And some of them are known to Benezet, and well, many of them from Philadelphia are known to Benezet, and vice versa. And then in 1761, the London Yearly Meeting sends out what they call a strong minute. That's the way Quakers like to minute things, and that's how what we would call policy is kind of made. But a strong
Okay.
minute, in which they actually say very clearly that that if you are a Quaker anywhere within the Society of Friends, and you're involved in slave trading or slave holding, then you will be, or you should be, in disunion. And so effectively from 1761, you are there was some pushback, but not that much. But you couldn't really be a Quaker and a slaveholder.
Mm.
Now, this is where Benezet really starts to kick in because
Okay.
he's been involved in this process up till 1761. He's been working with John Woolman and the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting and so on to um, sort of draft these documents. But after 1761, he realizes that um, this shouldn't just be a Quaker thing. It should be a general policy that it needs to be adopted across the Atlantic. That the British government, the colonial government we still don't forget this is before the Revolution
Sure.
in America. So the colonial governments and the British government should be themselves persuaded to turn against the slave trade and the whole system of enslavement. So it's really after 1761 that Benezet comes into his own, and he writes half a dozen very, very important documents or pamphlets. They get longer and longer and longer, and they all kind of follow the same method in a
Mm.
way, in which is what he's looking for is he's sort of leaning through the books that he's got in the libraries close to him, and what he's looking for is evidence of the um, human, social, and economic and theological reasons why slave trading needs to be ended. So, he looks through a lot of travels, particularly of slave traders. Most of them came out of some big collections that he must have had on his bookshelf or in a library near to him. But he starts to go through these and picking out stories from them, which show, on the one hand, how cruel the slave trade is, how cruel enslavement is in the Caribbean and in the American colonies in North America. Um, But on the other hand, he starts looking in these documents for accounts of Africa, particularly that show that without the interference of British slave traders, it would be a happy and peaceful place.
Mm.
He finds evidence that shows that Africa is a wealthy country with lots of natural produce and so on, and that dealing in Africa with what today we would call fair trade would be
Hmm.
more profitable and more ethical for everybody, but both in Africa, Europe, and America. So he kind of um, piles up this evidence in pamphlets that start off, a few dozen pages long, and they get longer and longer, more and more detailed, until he reaches what is his really kind of major work, and that comes out in 1771, and this is called Some Historical Account of Guinea. And we should remember in the 18th century, the word historical means natural history as well as political history. So it's not just about the past, it's also about the nature, the natural history of Guinea.
Okay.
And Guinea means Africa, West Africa in this. So some historical account of Guinea. And that's the really important book in 1771 that absolutely changes the abolitionist movement in some very, very fundamental ways. Um, so I can say a bit more about that unless
Sure. Well,
you have
give us
another question.
context too.
Yeah,
So, where is to jog our memories? Where is Wilberforce during this same time period? And Newton and all the rest of those guys. We've talked about them a pretty good bit on our podcast previous to do, but put that into context and time frame for this.
right.
Is it a little
Well,
earlier than them, or
yeah, Wilberforce would still be at school at
yeah?
this point. He was a young man. I can't off the top of my head remember when Wilberforce was born, but he was if not still a school child, certainly a young man in 1770. Um, we're, we've got some evidence that suggests that Benezet was in contact with John Newton.
Hmm.
So the 1771 historical account of Guinea includes a long anonymous letter from a slave trader, in which the anonymous slave trader sets out what is so cruel about the slave trading voyages he's been on. Now, a scholar called John Coffey a few years back published an article in which he had worked out that this was probably John Newton. So it
Ah,
does look very much like that Newton, who of course would become Wilberforce's mentor in later years, would that Newton and Benezet were in touch with each other. I think it's really important just to realize that in 1771, when this book, Some Historical Account of Guinea, came out, it's a very different world. So the American Revolution is just starting. It's another 5 years until the Declaration of Independence. But of course, the troubles, as you might think of them, are
right.
starting and so on at this point.
There's plenty of acts of
And
parliament during that time to make people mad, right?
yes, well, there's lots going on. So
Right.
it is a tumultuous period. But of course, the American Revolution would itself change the whole kind of attitude on both sides of the Atlantic to how empire should be managed.
Mm.
After um, the United States is recognized by Britain after 1782. That causes the British government to collapse, but it means and a period of political instability for a few years. But it also means people in the 1780s, including the young William Wilberforce, are starting to ask questions about how do we get empire right? If we're going to have an empire, how do we get it right?
Mm.
And so you get a number of people. Some names will be familiar, like William Wilberforce and Thomas Clarkson, perhaps others, perhaps less well known, like James Ramsay. But a lot of people in Britain in the 1780s starting to write about slavery and the slave trade. And what they do is they go back to the previous generation, in a sense, and they all find Benezet's 1771 um, historical account of Guinea. And one of the most important is perhaps Thomas Clarkson, who, whereas in England, whereas Wilberforce is the kind of parliamentary leader of the abolition movement in the
Hmm.
1780s and 90s, Thomas Clarkson is the kind of on the ground organizer. He's the person who's kind of going around collecting evidence, organizing the meetings, writing the books, and so on. But he starts out as a student in the middle of the 1780s, and he's set an essay. I always say to students of mine, when you're writing an essay, just think what it could do, where it could take you. Because
Right.
Clarkson writes an essay that he was set saying, is it lawful to make slaves of others? And he wrote the essay looking to win a prize. It was a prize essay at Cambridge University. And he when he wrote it, he realized that he believed what he was writing, and
Mm,
this student essay became his career as an abolitionist. But he went around and he asked people he knew at Cambridge and in London, who had connections with the Caribbean for their kind of to tell him what their experience of slavery and the slave trade. But he picked up one book in particular, and that was Benezet's historical account of Guinea. And so, what we've got here is the most important kind of political text of the English abolition movement, um, written by Thomas Clarkson, and it is essentially based on Anthony Benezet's book, written 15 years earlier. So we see
wow.
these kind of points of connection. And Benezet knew this very well because from the 1770s onwards, even though there's this kind of war going on across the Atlantic, he's still writing letters to British abolitionists. He's writing to British religious leaders. We know of a conversation that Benezet had with the Methodist leader, John Wesley, for
Mm,
example,
okay.
and the Anglican theologian Granville Sharp, who's an important early abolitionist as well.
Hmm.
And there's other names as well. But the point here is that Benezet is promoting his ideas. He's making sure that the book gets read across the Atlantic and throughout the whole kind of community, and not just Quakers. And it really is picked up in the 1780s. In fact, it's just after Benezet dies, really, that the ideas that he puts forward in his body of work suddenly become kind of mainstream politics in England and elsewhere.
Well, he's using a term we might use today. He's an early on thought leader, right? I mean, he's really thinking through these things as a way to say, this is, and let me back up. This is not just me trying to preach to you or me trying to be able to, this is wrong on a bunch of different levels, and here's why, and here's what if, we wouldn't have put our nose where it didn't belong, or what this would have been, or, a myriad of things that would have been helping people think so that when someone like Clarkson taps into him in a way that he had not maybe seen or heard of before, these dominoes come together. And of course, timing is everything, right? I mean, and so it's interesting to be able to see how something from somebody like Benezet is going from something that he believed and something that it wasn't so much like he was trying to lobby Parliament to be able to change things, was it? Was it more of a general to the public, hey, folks, we need to be thinking about this in a different way than you're thinking about it?
Yes. And of course, lobbying Parliament is difficult later in his life because he's no longer a citizen of the British Empire. But he certainly had been lobbying the Philadelphia the Philadelphia yearly meeting of Quakers, and they're also trying to have influence, through others, very famous
Sure.
characters in Philadelphia at this time, of course. Um, People like Benjamin Franklin and so on. And there's the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society that's set up in 1780, I think 1780. And So he's perhaps we might say lobbying. He's definitely a networker, even if his
Mm,
networking is often more to do with the pen or the quill. He's writing letters. He's asking people who are traveling more than he is to be in touch with each other. We know that there are Quakers who go to London bearing his books and bearing his message, which they then take to Quakers in London, and then the Quakers in London take it, and it's their job to lobby the British Parliament.
wow.
So his message is getting out there, his thinking is getting out there, but he's also, he's an assiduous networker, and that's really very, very important.
Yeah. Now, is he teaching during the same time too? Are the schools still operating while he's doing all this writing and research? And I forgot to ask you about his family life. Is he married with kids and he's trying to balance writing and teaching and being a husband and a father? Or kind of what's his life like during some of that same time period?
Yes, and like many historians interested in the public life, I perhaps haven't spent enough time thinking about his personal life. There is um, very good, very detailed biography of Benezet, which perhaps people might be interested in. It's written by Maurice Jackson. But the he was married. He was married to a Philadelphia woman called Joyce Marriott. They married in 1736. Um, I don't think he, do you know, I don't know whether they had children or not. If they did,
Oh,
they're certainly not. Um, this is something I should look up. Terrible admission,
no.
but they don't figure large in the narrative if he did. But yes, he does have that family life. So he is married. He is well known publicly, though. He's definitely a public figure, not just through his
Mhm.
education, through the schools, because he's teaching um, white Quakers as well as black people in Philadelphia. He he he's also, of course, what the Quakers would call a weighty friend. That is, one whose opinion is highly respected in
Mm,
those circles.
okay.
Um, and we know that um, he's also quite sociable. We've got lots of accounts of him sort of entertaining friends and so on, although not always with the results they expected, because he was a vegetarian and a teetotaler. So
Okay.
his dinner parties weren't necessarily the most sumptuous, but and as a plain Quaker, he was um he was sort of uh, very careful not to sort of indulge too much. But he knew that many of the most important people in his society, and I think one of the things that tells us a lot is that when he died, his funeral was a public event,
Okay.
and apparently thousands of people
Wow.
turned out on the streets, black and white, turned out on the streets to mourn him. And that we've got accounts of just how big a public occasion that was.
Yeah. Has anyone done any work, or is there kind of the story after? I mean, after he died, did the schools continue on? And are there people who said, "Hey, I'm Bishop Richard Allen. I went to school and got educated there under Benezet," or I just pulled him out of my ear. But I'm just saying others that would have said, "Yes, this is kind of a impact of who he educated in formerly enslaved people or African American people, whichever free or not. This is kind of where they got their start in being able to
Yes,
actually read and
yes,
write."
yes, yeah. Um, yes. So the school that he started teaching at, the Friends English School in Philadelphia, is still going.
Really?
It's the William Penn Charter School, I think. And so that's still there. That's a
Wow.
long-standing institution. Um, the school, which he called, as I said, using the language of the time, the Negro School in Philadelphia, carried on well into the 19th century. Um, and I don't think it lasted beyond the Civil War, but it
Okay.
certainly was continuing to teach black people in Philadelphia up into the 1850s.
Huh.
I'm afraid I haven't written down the names of some of the people who went to that school, but there is an illustrious list of people who were both teachers and students at that school into the 19th century. And I'm
Wow.
very sorry, but that's perhaps something
Yeah.
people might want to
Yeah, yeah.
look up
Well, I'm going to look it
themselves.
up. Right.
But yes,
I'm
so will I.
curious. Right. I mean, I'm just,
But yeah, but the school carried on going. It didn't die with him. It carried on going, until the Civil War. And I think the situation after the Civil War meant that education had changed quite differently
sure.
in 19th century America. So
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for taking this time to talk to us about such a fascinating character. Tell us where people can find more information about you and the speaking that you do, I know, but you also have a myriad of books that you have authored and at your website and places like that. So give us a little of that information so folks can follow up and learn more about the good work you've done.
well, luckily I have a very unique name. So if you can spell my name, you can find me anywhere on the internet. You just put my name into a search engine, Brycchan, Brycchan. Just my first name will do it.
We'll get it.
But you can find out lots about me that way, and through Northumbria University and my own website. Now, my own website, which is my name, brychancarey.com, coming on for 30 years now, I've been putting information there about um, um, Black history, mostly in the UK, so Black British history, about various projects that I've been working on, and these cross over between um, the sort of history or the cultural history of enslavement, the abolition of slavery, on the one hand, with my interest in religious history,
Hmm.
and also my interest in natural history. And we see with Benezet that these three things combine because in my last book, which is called The Unnatural Trade, I showed how Benezet used natural history,
Yeah.
the evidence he found in natural history, alongside his Quaker faith, to develop his argument against slavery and the slave trade. So that was the last book I wrote, was actually looking not just at Benezet, but more generally about how natural history was a repository of evidence that abolitionists could use to make a case against the slave trade in the late 18th century. Right now, I'm working less with the question of the abolition of slavery, and more with religion and natural history. So I'm
Mm.
currently writing actually a number of books about a sort of a figure known to historians as the parson naturalist or the clerical naturalist. These are clergymen and some women who also practiced natural history, which they did from about the 9th century in the early medieval period, and they're right through to the present day. So I've been looking
Wow.
at writing a study of those. So that's the sort of work I'm doing at the moment.
Well, yes. Well, we'd love to be able to find a time to be able to do another episode when you're up for it, to be able to talk about those things. We would love to be able that would fit squarely into the things that we do at the Center for Christian History, which people can follow more about what we do there at the centerforchristianhistory.com and learn more about what we do and how to support the effort into the things that we're working on as well. So, Professor, thank you so much for your time. We really, really appreciate it.
Thank you.